Hello, everyone. This is JT Keating, Vice President of Product Strategy for Zimperium. I'd like to welcome you to our webinar this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are, potentially evening, as we go around the globe. I'm going to wait for folks to be able to come in here just a little bit, but just to start off with, I would like to kind of give you some of the perfunctory things. The report itself is being delivered to everybody that has been registered for this webinar. It's being released today. We've already been briefing some of the folks in the press about this information. I'm very excited to come and talk to you about it because it's a topic that's near and dear to all of our hearts. This should be about 30 minutes. We usually try to keep these to 20, 25, but we want to make sure that you get a lot of value out of it. Please do use the Q&A section. Once we get finished actually running through all the data, then we'll come back and see if there are any questions. If there aren't, we don't make them up. We're not that company. We'll give you the rest of your day back. But if there are, then we will try to field them either live or getting back to you after the fact. So with that, we're going to dive into the report. And I always think it's important as we do this to kind of start off by kind of giving a little bit of an understanding about the report. The report itself comes from data. Zimperium is the leader in enterprise mobile threat defense. We literally have thousands of customers and tens of millions of endpoints around the world. This specifically comes from 45 million endpoints across dozens and dozens of customers that have given us the ability to use anonymized data for threat reporting. And so that's the basis of where the data comes. It's from the first half of the year coming this forward. We've actually used two different terms, and it's important to understand the difference between the two as we go through the report. Risks are those things that actually expose you to a greater likelihood of being able to be attacked, or if somebody does attack you, then you're more likely for it to be successful. Threats are also known as attacks, a combination of terms there, means you've actually been attacked. So there's a lot of really interesting data in here, but the bottom line is particularly as security teams have started to take over the driving force of mobile threat defense purchasing. Used to be mobility, now it's security. As the security guys have taken over, they've been importuning us for quite some time to basically answer one question, which is what % of my devices are exposed to each one of these risks or threats? So this focuses on enterprise endpoints. Now, I will tell you right up front, I think it's very important for everybody to understand this, that we understand that there are some places where this data is going to be, it is going to be a little bit off from the reality of the world. And the reason that is Zimperium's job is to protect our customers' employees at the first stop in the kill chain. So there's 4 basic attack vectors. There's device attacks, network attacks, phishing attacks, and malicious apps. Across those entire things, our job is to stop it at the first step of that entire process. So there are places, for instance, where we'll talk about device compromises might be understated in our report because we detected it and stopped it at a network attack. Point being, we're not a pure research company. And so therefore, some of these things will be a little bit off, and I will tell you where those things are. So with that, let's talk about the forest first. I think it is always helpful to kind of frame up the forest before we dive into the individual trees of the device, network, and app attacks. We're actually holding phishing for next quarter's threat report because we have some really interesting stuff coming with our machine learning detection of phishing sites. So this is going to be predominantly focused on the 3 vectors of device, network, and apps. So the very highest level, the percentage of devices that we have that have detected risks, again, inherently more vulnerable versus threats, makes a lot of sense. I mean, if you think about it, it's almost so many different parts of life is basically like a funnel. You need to have X number coming in the top to go to the next step, to go to the next step. Well, the top of this whole thing is, are we exposing ourselves to risks like we're going to be talking about? Now that we're doing that, what is the likelihood that we're actually being attacked as a part of that funnel? So roughly 90-10 risks to threats. Now, The other thing is this is percentage of devices, number of devices that actually had each one of those. And so the fact is there is some overlap. It's not pure. There are guys that had risks that also had threats, but in terms of the overall pie, this is the breakdown. So a lot of risks and a decent number of threats, but the risks, of course, are the beginning part. If you take a step down and go to the risks by operating system, it's pretty interesting right off the bat. And we're going to go into each of the device, network, and apps sections. And in each one, we're going to go risks first and then threats second. But when you look at the risks, the thing that really pops out is the fact that from a percentage of devices that expose to each one of these risks, the app risk category in Android is significantly higher than that on iOS. And that is the part that is kind of opened and shifted and is a very consistent theme as we go through here, is that today the app part definitely still shows an Android issue. Now, one of the things you'll see in the report, and there's been a lot of stuff that's been talked about recently, the Supreme Court of the United States, there's a sidebar with an article and you can follow that. Supreme Court of the United States recently ruled against Apple enabling consumers to be able to sue Apple to provide access to third-party app stores. That's going to make this very interesting because our data shows that the vast majority of the malware that we have, the vast majority of the malware that we have on Android comes from third-party app stores, not from the traditional stores. So when we shift over to the threat side of things, this is where these devices have actually been attacked. It again is really interesting. The primary thing that jumps out here first, and then you got to go down another level. The primary thing that jumps out here first is 45% of the attacks on Android were malicious app-based attacks, whereas almost 100% of the network attacks were on, or iOS attacks were network-based. Two things to point out here. One, we detected way more attacks on iOS than we have on Android. Now, that's also led by the fact that about 70% of our endpoints are iOS. Second point is the device compromises and the malicious apps. Those numbers, again, are somewhat artificially inflated or deflated because of the fact that we stopped it on the network. But it's really important as you kind of go through this, and there's a great article that came out in Forbes yesterday talking about the fact that iOS is not bulletproof and iOS is not a completely secure platform. It is a platform like all platforms. So as we dive into the trees, you're going to see some of that really bear itself out. So, like I said, there's the forest. Have a view of the risks and threats at the highest level and a little bit by the operating systems. Now we're going to step into each of the device, network, and malicious apps. And for each one of those sections, we're going to start with risks, and then we're going to go into threats. So, device risks. And in the report, what you'll see is we've actually written it where there's key findings, and then we can talk about it. I've pretty much mirrored that, but I'm just going to provide a little commentary. So, highest level, 27% of all endpoints, enterprise endpoints, were exposed to device risks. So it's 1 in 3 were exposed to some sort of device risk and therefore made themselves more likely to be attacked. When you get into the vulnerabilities or the CVEs, we found that the vendors created excuse me a quick second. Sorry about that, quick technical difficulty. So the vendors produced a record number of patches for vulnerabilities in the first half of 2018. Apple had a 54% increase. They had 185 CVEs compared to 120 last year. The most important thing here is 62% of those, by Apple's own thought process, were considered critical. They actually had one patch that came out that had over 50 CVEs in a single patch. Point of that whole thing is Apple is as a platform, as it's coming out, people are finding more and more things that need to get patched in the operating system to close some holes for easy exploits. And Apple is very aggressively patching those. So that's that's a good sign, but it also shows with the number that they're very exposed. When we shift over to Google, Google actually produced a significantly higher number, 255 versus 185, but that was actually a drop of almost 500 during the same time frame in 2018. It's interesting that 20% were considered critical, but another 79% were considered high. And the matching between the definitions of the two of them are not completely a perfect sync, apples to apples. So roughly almost 100% between high and critical on the Android side of things. So opening up very big exposures to known vulnerabilities and therefore exploits that are publicly available. When it comes to actually installing patches, the lag is very visible. And we've all heard about this. Obviously, Apple controls its update mechanism directly because they control their operating system and the relationship with the carriers. When you go over to the Android side, Google produces a patch. They have to give it to all the manufacturers. The manufacturers have got to get it out to all of their endpoints. So the distribution and the lag is pretty evident. So 60% of the Android devices were more than 5 versions behind. 60% of all devices were on versions 5 behind. If a version is 1 or 2 behind, there's known exploits. So we just picked that as a spot versus only 28% for iOS. So as I move to the next slide, this is the distribution of iOS. You'll see visibly how the things change as it goes to Android. So you can see that mix. It's a pretty fascinating swing, and we've got a little bit more additional detail on this in the report itself. When it comes to other device risks, we're talking PIN codes, whether or not it has a PIN code, whether or not it is encrypted, whether or not there's developer options enabled. When it comes to those, one of the things we found interesting is this report is really focused on the enterprise endpoints. But we also have millions of consumers through partners and through customers that use our app inside of their mobile apps. And it was interesting that most of the device risks were very consistent between enterprise and consumer. The only exception to that was USB debugging, which makes sense. And that's where you can actually enable your phone to be debugged if you're producing apps. There was twice as much of that on enterprise as it was on the consumer side. So that's the risk kind of picture, mostly having to do with vulnerabilities, PIN codes, encryption, all the rest of that kind of fun stuff. Then you shift over to the threat side of things, actual attacks. Device exploits, actually compromising a device or gaining elevated privilege or elevated access, is the end game of attackers. As long as there's been security, persistence has been the end of the game. They've always wanted to be persistent as long as possible and to remain on the computer as long as possible, whether it's a server, point of sale system, or now mobile. The only way to be persistent in mobile, given the fact that apps are in containers, operating system is locked down, the only way to be persistent is to either compromise the device or elevate privileges or access in some way, shape, or form. Those are the device threats. So networks, phishing, apps, those are all end games to get to that from a persistent standpoint. Yes, you can lose data, you can lose credentials directly from those other threat vectors, but the ultimate one is the device side. This is the key finding on this to start off with is a very small had complete compromise. Very small had a complete compromise, root access, that side of things. Jailbreaking is actually an app risk. It's not a device threat. Jailbreaking is something a user does. And we'll talk about that in the app risk category. But this is a full-on complete compromise. Very low number, very low number. We know for a fact, largely because of our consumer data, that this number is a fraction of reality. This is exactly why when we get to the network attack side or the app attack, those vectors as roads that come into compromising the device, since we stop them at those steps, we know that this is low. So it's still a major issue. If you have any devices that have been completely compromised that walk in and out of your network, it's an issue, but this number is low. When you actually look at the types of threats that we found in there, I won't spend a lot of time on this because it's super techie stuff. 98% of the attacks came from 3 different sort of approaches. You can see abnormal processes actually doing the tampering or rooting the device. So the majority of all those device threats came from those three compromise areas. Now, I mentioned at the onset, be a little careful when you're looking at that threat data of iOS versus Android, because it can be very misleading. There's four vectors: device, network, phishing, apps. Of those four today, previous to the Supreme Court stuff, the only one that Apple has an inherent advantage in is malicious apps. The bad guys still want to get on iOS. And so what they've done is they figured out there's a thing called a profile. A profile is a configuration change on iOS that enables a legitimate app to actually be above, have privileges above and beyond, and access above and beyond the containers that a normal app would have. So what the bad guys have done on iOS is, rather than even waste their time trying to get through all the vetting in the App Store, they've actually pivoted and said, we're going to deliver we're going to trick people into installing profiles, which give them elevated access right off the bat. So when you think iOS, the primary thing from a threat standpoint, or a primary thing from a threat standpoint from a device standpoint, are malicious profiles. Some of the dangerous ones we have here, and we're going to actually describe them all in the report: side-loaded app stores, enabling you to just automatically pull stuff in, all the way down to jailbreak profiles, unmanaged root certificates where you can actually deal with the encryption side of things. So profiles are a real risk because it immediately gives them that elevated access. In a sample of basically 200,000 of these profiles, 68% were considered high risk. And what that means is that they had immediate ability to elevate access and elevate privileges and be able to steal, deliver exploits, things on those lines. So nothing else. When you think in iOS, you need to be thinking about profiles as a concern. Let's pivot over to the network side. As I mentioned, our job has always been to protect the enterprise. We've known from the very beginning that the most targeted way to target an enterprise, the bad guys are really bad dudes, but they're very good at what they do, and they're very efficient. If you're targeting XYZ company, you're not going to drop an app in the App Store and hope somebody from XYZ company downloads it. It's a very inefficient business model. You might get lucky, but these guys aren't focused on luck. If you're targeting XYZ, what you're going to do is you're going to put up a fake network or do a man-in-the-middle attack. And when you do that, you do that let's say right outside the office of XYZ company, or even mimic XYZ company's own network. Wait till somebody from XYZ connects to it, use that information to survey the device, figure out what operating system they're on, most likely outdated, as we were just talking about in the device risks, then deliver the exploit to be able to compromise the device, be persistent, weaponize the device, you're off to the races. So network attacks are almost always the beginning part of the kill chain in an enterprise threat today. Phishing is coming up a little bit. We're going to talk about that next quarter, but network attacks are an absolute primary. Side note, that's exactly why we do all of our detection on device. If the bad guy owns the network 9 times out of 10, you better be able to defend yourself. The first thing he will do, if you have a cloud-based detection service, is cut off that part of the traffic. So we've always believed, as the guys protecting the enterprise, network was going to be the first attack. Bad guy was going to own it quite often, and he was going to deliver an exploit or malicious profile, as we were talking about a minute ago. So what are the network risks? Well, first of all, a third of all endpoints encountered risky networks. And so of all the enterprise mobile endpoints we had, a third of them encountered risky networks. Well, what are risky networks? Well, there's really 3 big buckets. There's unsecured Wi-Fi. That's literally unencrypted, just no password, completely unsecured. Then you have captive portals. Captive portals are, you've all seen them, you log into, you go to the hotel, a web page comes up, says, welcome to Marriott or whatever. You need to put your information in and, you're off to the races, right? Well, the minute that's risky, or the reason that's risky, not all captive portals are risky, and this is why it's not a threat, but any web page can deliver an exploit. As that browser is processing that web page, they can deliver an exploit. So that makes it riskier. The 7% are scans, where literally the network is scanning the device to see, what type of device is it, what OS is it on, that sort of thing. Obviously risky behavior because it could lead to something else. So the threats, as we said, first of all, almost 1 out of 10 mobile endpoints were exposed to actual network attacks. Actual network attacks, not risks, actual network attacks. So that's a pretty staggering number if you think about it. 1 out of 10 of these devices that are in the hands of the user, because the user is the admin, spending all this time outside of the corporate network, connected to networks that could lead to either data loss, credential loss, or delivery of an exploit that can be completely compromising the device. So 1 out of 10 led to that. When you actually look at it, 93% of the attacks in the first half of this year, and 86% of all threats and attacks were man-in-the-middle attacks. So straight MIDM or MIDM variation, this is where the attackers can actually hijack the traffic, and as I mentioned a minute ago, steal credentials and or exploit the device. Rogue access points are a relatively small number, but still a very dangerous number. This is a straight legitimate or straight illegitimate Wi-Fi network that the phones will connect to. And then the SSL downgrade is literally stripping out the SSL and leaving traffic out in plain text, basically. But the man-in-the-middle attack is the primary. Of the MIDMs, a particular type, which we talk about in the report, of an ARP MIDM, which is an address resolution protocol. It's basically kind of poisoning the ARP table, so you're going someplace you don't think you're going. You think you're going one place, you're going a totally different direction. Actually, it was 45% of total attacks in the enterprise. So in the first half of this year, ARP MIDMs represented 45% of the attacks. It's going to be really interesting as we look to the tail end of the year to see whether that holds as their favorite weapon or if they start to change course a little bit. If we look at it from a regional standpoint, it's pretty interesting. The Republic of Korea just lights up like a Christmas tree. On our solution, we've got a thing called Danger Zone. It's an actual visual map that a user can look at to see if there's bad Wi-Fi networks, previously detected bad Wi-Fi networks or MIDM attacks in areas around them. And in Seoul and some of these places, it just lights up. I mean, it's just like a Christmas tree. So you can see that almost a third in the first half of the year were the Republic of Korea. Clearly, heavy focus, certain set of attackers. But the other remaining 69% were very evenly spread out across a bunch of different countries, showing that it is, in fact, a worldwide phenomena. And when we actually dive down into the city side of things, you can see that as well. You can see, obviously, Seoul, like we said, right there at the top, along with some of the other Republic of Korea cities. But then it starts to go down. But the top 10, even with that factoring in, there's 85% of the network attacks were still occurring outside of the top 10 cities. So pretty wide distribution, even though there was a concentration in Korea when it comes to the network attacks. Shifting over to the app side of the world, again, starting with risks and going to threats. I think it's really important when we start thinking about app risks. It's kind of like, what do we mean by app risks? Everybody already knows and thinks about app threats, malicious apps that can actually, conduct theft, and we'll get into those here in a quick second. But it's critical to understand that app risks is a crucial vector that you need to figure out. Multiple reasons, and what are the high-level types of app risks? Well, one type of app risk is, I mentioned it earlier about jailbreaking. If you're allowing access to third-party app stores, whether it's by jailbreaking or just by enabling it directly on Android, you're exposing yourself to additional risk, right? Another type of risk is perfectly legitimate apps that are in your environment, that are on your employees' devices. But as we all know, mobile apps are a bunch of Legos. The developers are in a hurry. They're under the gun. They're supposed to produce something, and somebody says, hey, we need access to the camera. They Google, they go find an SDK or a library, throw that Lego into their app, and off to the races, without realizing that for even perfectly legitimate apps, there are risks from a privacy standpoint or a security standpoint. that are out. They're not malicious yet, but they're exposing, and we're going to go into those. So just kind of framing that up for you. So first thing, 5% of endpoints had sideloaded apps from sources outside the authorized stores, or were enabled to be able to do so. I think the thing that's really interesting, and it continues down that theme, almost a little over a third of the Android devices had sideloaded apps versus only 2% for iOS. Again, back to what I was saying earlier about Supreme Court stuff, it's going to be very interesting to see how this changes if Apple is forced to open up access to third-party app stores. So now I will say, because that 36% number is a very large number, a relatively large percent of our Android devices are in regions, particularly the APAC region, that third-party app stores are very much part of the game, very much culturally accepted, very much. So, I do believe, and again, I'm trying to provide the clear value to you guys and the clear vision. I do believe since a decent chunk of our devices are in that region, that number is higher than if we truly were looking at Android all the way across the world on a more even distribution. That's more a function of where our customers are that have Android. I talked about security and privacy risks. Here's some examples. 70% of iOS apps have advertising capabilities, and Bluetooth beacon usage, local advertising capabilities, went from 38% to 69%. Now, you might say, well, why are those risks? Well, anything that has advertising capability clearly is potentially sending sensitive data someplace, exposing people from a privacy standpoint. And the same thing with the Bluetooth beacon, because as the Bluetooth beacon is coming up, it basically is sending some information out in clear text, and it's connecting to things around it. And there aren't enough legitimate Bluetooth beacons like what started with Macy's in the in-store stores. We're still one of the biggest examples out there. The connection between the number of apps that have this capability in it and the actual beacons that are out there doesn't sync yet, which means that there's still a big hole because people might not even know that this stuff is being beaconed out and something else can beacon back in. So it creates a risk there. A quarter of iOS apps pass sensitive information unencrypted. I think this is amazing. Literally 1/4 of all these apps send information off unencrypted. That is a privacy risk. So if you can obviously, kind of figure that out, especially if you're GDPR or CCPA regions, you would need to know what of my apps are doing this. What are my apps sending it to another cloud server? 10% of the apps, external payloads. So when you go through the app store initially, you get vetted, and that's where all the vetting process is. 10% of the apps, 1 in 10, were able to actually put a new payload in as a part of the updating that didn't get vetted by the app stores. So literally, you can obviously see where the risks come with that. And then 16% of the apps actually hard-coded credentials. So the credentials, instead of it being something that was tokenized or anything, it was literally hard-coded, which means obviously that you can expose and you can backwards create some problems with that. So finishing this out, because I promised you I was gunning for about 30 minutes and I'm almost there already. Let's get to the category that everybody initially thinks is the biggest problem. But as we've already been talking about, ultimate end game is the device. Network is the primary delivery mechanism. But app threats are still very much out there. And as we get into it, we'll continue painting the same story. First thing, just for what it's worth, our machine learning-based engine, Z9, it's the only one that can do on-device detection of malware on Android today. It also detects iOS apps by machine learning, but that has to be after an inventory from an MDM. That's a function of iOS. No app except an MDM can get an inventory of other apps that are on the device on iOS. You can on Google. So whether it was on-device on Android or after the inventory on iOS, Z9 detected literally thousands, tens of thousands of malicious apps that were not in VirusTotal or any other repository. So our machine learning-based engine is detecting these things coming out all the time. It's interesting that every once in a while you see a new blog about a new type of malware that's coming out and people are writing about it. If we wrote a blog for every piece of malware that we that we detected, first of all, you guys would be sick and tired of it, and you would, unsubscribe. You just can't. I mean, you just can't, because it's just out of hand, which is why you need machine learning to be able to detect it. For the apps that we detected, I mentioned earlier, they represented 45% of all attacks on Android versus less than 1% on iOS today, which means, of course, not surprisingly, that it's really 99%, even though I said 98% at the top, of the app threats were on Android. So when you look at it, these are ones that have been actually detected and were actually designed. Now, it's for what it's worth, when we actually look at the apps and we break them apart, and this wasn't part of the report because our report was focused on how do you protect enterprise employees on their endpoints and what percentage of the devices have each one of these risks and threats. But the vast majority of all malware is still based first and foremost on consumer fraud. That is the ultimate objective for the vast majority of malware. They do and can deliver exploits to compromise the device, but the majority of actual malware, malicious apps, are still very much designed for fraud. Perfect example being BankBot, which we've talked about before. If you look at the kind of similar to what we did on the network side, where did we detect the malicious apps? This does not mean where did the malicious apps come from. This is where we detected these. And you can see that the top 5 countries represented about a half of the detections. So it's a pretty large number. When you get into the cities again, you can see that 80% occurred outside of the top 10 cities. The highest city there actually being the city of Hong Kong, the central city of Hong Kong. So it is across the board, again, a worldwide phenomena, but you can also see that there's still that APAC influence I was mentioning around our Android devices, and therefore, of course, there's an influence there of the major cities that are there. So, summary of the key findings: 27% exposed to device risks, tremendous number of patches that are coming out, a huge percentage of which were considered either critical or high. Profiles, we already talked about, the majority of the profiles that are out there that we found, malicious ones, were high risk. When we moved over to the network side, 32% encountered risky, and almost 1 in 10 actually were exposed to network attacks, actually sitting on networks the bad guys were playing with. The ARP MIDIMs being the primary delivery mechanism. The Republic of Korea off the charts in terms of number of detections, but still the majority of the attacks still occurred outside of that area, 70+%. We talked about our detection capability. Android attacks, 45% versus less than 1 for iOS. The side-loaded apps, again, 36% of the Android being a big number right there. And then some of the app risk things around advertising networks and sensitive data. So I'm going to stop there and see what questions we may or may not have. Like I said, everybody's going to be getting the actual report itself. Even after you get the report, if you've got questions on it, we're obviously always here to help answer any of those questions. Like I said, and by the way, you might also, I would strongly suggest following us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, all the rest of those, because there are threats that come out all the time that you need to be aware of, and that's a really good way to find it. So I don't see that we have any questions, so I would like to thank everybody for hanging with me a little past the 30 minutes I talked about. And I'd like to ask you all to have yourself a great day. Go get yourself a hamburger or something and relax, and have a fantastic day, and let us know if you have any questions going forward. Thank you very much.